Good evening, everybody. Suzanne Dibble here, data protection law expert, coming to you raw and uncut. And today, following some lively discussion in the Facebook group, I thought I would address the pressing issue of GDPR and business cards. Is it still possible to go to your networking meetings and exchange business cards and follow up after the networking session is over? Is it still possible although arguably it was questionable whether you could anyway, or certainly whether it was good practice, is it still possible to add those people to your mailing list in the hope that they might be interested in your goods and services? Is it still possible to have the goldfish bowl at your exhibitions and conferences and ask people to drop their business cards in there in return for entering them into a free draw, and then put them on your mailing list for your goods and services? What does GDPR say about all that, and what's the impact? Well, GDPR doesn't directly talk about swapping business cards, but let's look at the principles of GDPR. Are we processing personal data? Yes, we are. From the combination of data on their business card, you can clearly identify a natural person. So we are processing personal data just by taking, well, actually, that's not quite right. If we take the business card and you just leave it in the bottom of your drawer, then it's not actually covered, because what GDPR says is there has to be an element of automated processing, or if it's hard copy data, it's part of a filing system. So if that business card went into a Rolodex of cards that's arranged in alphabetical order, for example, then it would be subject to the provisions of GDPR. But let's take it that you're going to put it onto some kind of database or in some filing system, and it's going to be subject to GDPR. What can you do with that data? Well, the second step is, of course, to look at your lawful ground of processing. And as we know, if you've watched any of my trainings or videos, consent is just one of those lawful grounds. Now, are you, when you exchange your business cards, are you going to say to them, so subject to GDPR, my lawful ground of processing is consent. Can you sign this statement now to confirm that you're happy that I add you into my contacts and follow up with you after this? Well, that'd be nice if you could do that, but chances are you're not. It's noisy and busy at the end of networking meetings, and you're probably not going to get the chance to do that. So what can you do? Well, if you can have a version of that conversation, that's great. Consent can be oral. However, the difficulty that you have is keeping a record of that consent, which is required by GDPR. So I imagine that if you went straight back home and wrote yourself a little note saying, recording the conversation that you'd had with each individual who'd agreed to you processing their personal data, that would probably suffice. But are you in reality actually going to do that? So the other grounds of processing, the main one that's potentially relevant here, is legitimate interests. And if you've watched any of my trainings or videos, you'll know that this is the grey area. It's really not black and white. So you have to carry out your legitimate interest assessment form, which is in my pack, and it is that balancing test between your legitimate interests and the rights and freedoms of the individual. Now, arguably, if you'd had a conversation at that networking event and that person had shown interest in what you do, had asked for a follow-up email, or had in some way indicated that they wanted to know more, then it would be reasonable to say that they would expect you to follow up with information about your goods and services, and you could rely on legitimate interests. If you didn't mention your services at all, or indeed it sounded that they weren't interested, then obviously it'd be very difficult to rely on legitimate interests. But make sure that you do that assessment. Every time you want to rely on legitimate interests, you need to fill in that assessment form, and importantly, keep it on record. It's one of the key bits of guidance from the ICO is exactly that. If you want to rely on legitimate interest, because it's such a grey area, you need to have documented your decision-making process and have kept it on record. Okay, so that's the grounds of processing. You also have to be one of the main principles of GDPR is that you have to be very transparent about the purposes of the processing. So at some point in that as you're collecting that data, you need to be telling them what you're going to be doing with that data. And the place that we typically do that, again, if you've watched any of my training, you'll know that's in your privacy notice. Now, actually, I was just reading a little bit about this online, and I came across a blog from a guy who'd phoned the ICO up about this exact point, because he had had an academic debate with some people who had suggested that at the networking meeting, you would literally have to stand there and run them through your privacy policy before you could take away that business card and store it on your database or do anything else with it. So he phoned the ICO up, and it says, the person I spoke to at the Commissioner's office plainly thought it was unreasonable to expect an exchange of privacy notices at a networking event. However, he did go on to suggest that if you do email that person afterwards, that you provide the required information in the body of your first and any subsequent email. Okay, so what the ICO guidance is there, this was just over the phone, was that if you take a business card and you just want to follow up and say, hey Jeff, nice to meet you, here's some more details on what we were talking about, then at that point in that first email, then you should include your privacy notice in there. This blog here does say provide the required information in the body of the email, so I'm not sure if that's suggesting that you would have to actually have in the email the text of the privacy policy, or whether a link to the privacy policy would suffice. But certainly when it refers to giving that information in subsequent emails, I would imagine that just a link to your privacy policy in the footer of your email would suffice. But you do need to, whenever you are collecting personal data, you need to provide them with certain information, and that's set out in Article 13 of GDPR. And that states that where personal data relating to a data subject are collected from the data subject, the controller shall, at the time when personal data are obtained, provide the data subject with all of the following information, which is why the academic point is that according to the letter of that law, you should, when you take that business card, because that's the point that it's collected, you should be giving them your privacy policy, but clearly the ICO have agreed that that is unreasonable. So what about using the old goldfish bowl for entering prize draws? And indeed, even when you obtain a business card for an individual follow-up, does that mean you can then put them on your wider database for marketing your goods and services? Well, no, I don't think it's ever been good practice to do that. But certainly under GDPR, I think people are going to become much more switched on to their data protection rights, and certainly if they receive emails from people that they don't recognise, you're going to be receiving a lot more complaints. It's just not worth doing, is it? It's so much more effective to be transparent and upfront about what you're doing. So the free draws. Now, with the free draws, you would have to be, again, very transparent and upfront about what you're doing with it. So aside from the law that goes around free draws and competitions, and there is law about that, so do look into that if you're ever going to be running one of those. But in terms of purely GDPR, then what you need to do is you need to be completely upfront about the fact that you're going to be adding them to your marketing database, and generally in that situation you're going to need to obtain their consent. What that might look like is a clipboard with a privacy statement at the top, and then rows where people can complete their name, their email address and their signature to show that they have consented to you then following up with marketing emails. So let's not forget, GDPR is not here to stop small business owners doing business or getting new leads or marketing or anything like that. All it's doing is telling us that we have to be a lot more transparent and upfront about what we're doing. We have to be mindful of having a lawful ground for processing, and you know, I mean, it's just good practice, isn't it? You know, to not be adding people who don't want to be on our email list to the email list. I'm not actually sure that any of this it's not new with GDPR. It's just that the increased sanctions are focusing people's minds on what and what isn't allowed. So yes, we can still collect data. We can still collect business cards at networking meetings and conferences and everything else. We don't have to stand there and recite our privacy policies as we're handing over our business cards. But what we do need to be very mindful of is to be very transparent about what we're doing with that data. And a follow-up, I think, is absolutely fine. Just remember to pop your privacy policy, a link to the privacy policy on the first and subsequent emails. And if you do want to add them to your mailing list, then you need to be getting consent for that and being very upfront and transparent about it. So I hope that helps. I say GDPR not out to get small business owners. We just need to be sensible about it.